Hello, I'm Sophia, and I have with me here Alison and Rafi, who are third year medics at Hertford. Then we also have Professor Vlad, and he's here to speak to us about hibernation and all things sleep. And it's really exciting at the moment. So he's an associate professor of neuroscience, and he can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think he studies the dynamics of brain activity during sleep. And at the moment, which is particularly interesting, is Vlad's current research. And I think he's leading the project with the European Space Agency on hibernation, which is particularly focused on the benefits this might provide for space travel and astronauts. So it's really exciting, and we're really lucky to be able to interview him and have him at Hertford, really, as one of our tutors. So to get us started, I would like to ask you, Vlad, how did you kind of get into this field of research, and what made you really excited about sleep and hibernation, and kind of, got people thinking about that topic?
Okay, first of all, thank you very much for talking to me. It's a real pleasure. I know that hibernation as a topic attracts a lot of interest this day. Well, it always had, because it is a fascinating question, fascinating condition, but there is also a lot of misunderstanding about the concept. This probably that contributes to the interest we are having about this, around the subject. So I graduated. I studied at the University of Kharkov in Ukraine. So this is where I graduated, and I was always interested in studying animals. So I always thought of myself as a zoologist. And as you know, animals, they can do a lot of things that we humans cannot do really. So they're so well adapted to the changes in the environment, and hibernation is one of those unique adaptations that the animals are equipped with, and we somehow have lost, apparently. And I was interested at that point, and I did my master's thesis at the Institute of Cryobiology and Cryomedicine in Ukraine. I worked in the laboratory of hypothermia. So in that laboratory, they worked on developing paradigms to use cooling of the brain to treat mental disorders. So it's it sounds a bit exotic, but indeed there was some interest in this area. So I wanted to approach this from a different direction. I wanted to know, how do animals deal with such extreme challenges, such as cooling of their organism. And then at some point I decided to start to look for a PhD, and I looked around, and I found a laboratory at the University of Zurich, and they worked with hamsters, with one of species of hamsters called Jungarian hamsters. These animals, they come from Siberia, so they belong to those species who every winter spend a lot of time in a state called torpor. So I was absolutely fascinated by that. So I wrote a letter or an email to this laboratory, and I actually ended up doing my PhD at the University of Zurich in Switzerland. Although my very first paper was about hamsters, and then I changed the direction completely. So I started working on sleep, and only now in the recent years, I started to work on torpor again.
Yeah. Amazing. That's so fascinating. I like how you went from animals back to humans and left hibernation and going back to it now. So at the moment, your current research, which you did an interview for Radio 4 on, what's like the most important thing coming from that research at the moment?
Okay, so then, in the interview for Radio 4, so they introduced me as someone who leads the European Space Agency research. So it is not, I have to say, it is not entirely true. So I'm part of a team of experts who come from different fields. This initiative was started by the European Space Agency some years ago, I believe something like 6 or 7 years ago, and I was approached as an expert in sleep, and also they knew that I'm interested in this topic. So the group is quite diverse. So this group of people, they work on metabolism, on circadian rhythms, there are clinicians involved and also people with engineering background. There are neurophysiologists, there are geneticists. So there are people who are interested in the broader question of hibernation from different angles. And then the aim of this so-called topical team on hibernation and torpor, which is organized and supported by the European Space Agency, is to define strategies on how to approach the question of hibernation in humans, on the possibility of hibernation in humans, theoretical and practical, and of course on deciding what could be the practical applications of this.
Brilliant. Yeah, so that was going to be my next question. What are the practical applications of hibernation as in humans and as we know it?
Yes, practical applications. So first of all, if we talk about the end goal, the final goal about hibernation and astronauts, maybe at this point I would like to kind of talk a bit about definitions, about basic definitions. Like what is it that we are talking about?
Yeah.
So everybody knows about cryosleep, right? So sometimes you call it a cryosleep or stasis or hibernation, right? There are many words around this topic. So the idea is, of course, that astronauts can be put in a state of depressed metabolism when they are presumably unconscious or they're in a sleep-like state, and they of course they consume much less food, if any, right? So this is a very, very important practical application, and they can spend in this state for many months ideally, so that by the time they wake up, so they wake up only when they arrive to destination, to Mars, for example. So what is this state? So the state may look like sleep. So, and this is a bit where I'm coming from as someone who works on sleep. And here we immediately have a problem that we do not fully understand how hibernation and sleep are related to each other. So why is it so difficult? It is because we define sleep by criteria related to brain activity and behavior. So what is sleep? It is a state when your brain activity is reduced, when you're not moving, and your ability to respond to stimuli from outside is reduced. So this is how we operationally define sleep, although sleep is a mysterious state, so we can talk forever about just what sleep is. Hibernation, in contrast, is defined based on metabolism, based on metabolic rates. So we talk about torpor or hibernation as a state when metabolic rates are reduced. So therefore, sleep and torpor, the relationship between two states becomes not very straightforward. You see, if you use different sets of criteria to define sleep and hibernation, then in theory, they can overlap. So potentially, you can be awake and asleep while hibernating, right? So theoretically, we cannot exclude this possibility. And this is when it becomes especially interesting how this state can occur from the neurophysiological point of view, how we can create this state, because it suggests that you can run into some very important problems. And we can talk maybe about this later, about consequences of torpor on the brain and so on. But this is something that I really want to clarify from the very beginning. So we still need to define what exactly is the state that we would like to induce, let's say in astronauts or in some other conditions, before we can really think about specific practical applications and practical benefits.
Brilliant. Yeah. What kind of how theoretically would you go about trying to characterize, like neurologically, what hibernation is?
Yes. There are several kind of mechanisms in the brain which are responsible for regulation of our metabolism. So probably one approach would be to somehow make the brain to reset the set point that maintains metabolism at a certain level. So our metabolic rates, they change all the time. They change depending on the level of demands, right? So when I'm just sitting or when I'm in the bed and doing nothing, my metabolic rates are low, relatively low. When I climb stairs, or I don't know, I cross the bridge at Harvard College, so I consume more energy, right? So it is actually quite remarkable that our metabolic rates can change a lot on a like moment-to-moment basis. So there is a very broad dynamic range, and this is regulated seamlessly, right? So we, depending on the requirements, metabolic rates can go up and down. So I think the way we should be approaching this question is we need to understand how it is regulated, and then we can probably tune the levels of metabolism up and down. In this respect, sorry.
How would you go about inducing a change in metabolism and in putting someone into a state of hibernation then?
That's the key question, that we do not really know how animals do it spontaneously and voluntary. I think this is the key question. So when we get together with our European Space Agency group, so these are all very intelligent people, so we all know a lot, but when we start thinking, okay, how on earth do animals initiate the process? And we do not know. And it is deeply embarrassing that we just do not know how the animals enter this state spontaneously, voluntary. But this is again where sleep, approaching it through sleep may be especially promising, because if you think, how do we initiate sleep? It is also something very interesting happens at the moment when you transition from wake to sleep. So you don't never notice the moment when you transition from wake to sleep, right? So and especially if you think hard about initiating your sleep, right? Then this makes sure that you never fall asleep, right? So you cannot forcefully enter this sleep state. But I consider sleep as a potentially very promising window into regulation of metabolism, because our metabolic rates, they especially decrease during sleep. So sleep is a time period when you are fasting by definition, so you're not eating when you are sleeping, and our physiology is organized across the day in such a way that there are time periods when you are feeding and your metabolism is regulated to create your energy stores, for example, for consumption later, or for building proteins, for creating storage of fat and so on. And there are periods when you are consuming your stores, and this is mostly during sleep. It is like in plants, during the day they can produce energy from the through photosynthesis, and then during the night they consume the starch they accumulated during the day. And plants are remarkably good at that, so they know exactly how much store they have, and they consume it during the night in order to survive until the morning. So something similar we can find also here, when you enter the state of sleep, your metabolic rates decrease, and I think the real promising approach would be to somehow enhance that process and to reset the levels of metabolism at that stage, so that from sleep you go into a state of hibernation.
Yeah, brilliant. Rafi?
So you mentioned cryo sleep, or so hypothermia-induced sleep. How does that work, and what other different mechanisms do we induce sleep, perhaps even in animals, so outside of humans? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So first of all, it is important to clarify that hypothermia is not the same as hibernation or torpor. And this also sometimes creates a misunderstanding, because we think that if you cool down a human body, then you put it in a state of hibernation. In hibernation, physiological condition, it happens another way around. first your metabolic rates are reduced, and then you passively cool down. So the hypothermia is secondary to reduction of metabolic rates. So the second part of your question is how we produce sleep, right? Or
hibernation. Apologies. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's the question that we do not really know. We know about some factors that can increase your propensity for entering the state. And for example, in our hamsters, so now we have a colony of hamsters here in Oxford. So we are breeding hamsters. I have full room of like 100 animals. So we are very proud of that. And everybody in the animal facility, of course, everybody loves them. They're really cute. So as cute as they get. And you can make them to change the phenotype from summer to winter by shortening the day length. So all you need to do, you can also decrease temperature, but it is not necessary. All you do is you make the night long and day short. They think it is winter. Their body, their physiology thinks it is winter is coming, and they turn white. They lose some weight, and they start entering the state of torpor. So this is very interesting. We know that circadian rhythms are involved in regulation of torpor and melatonin, for example, one of the hormones which involved in circadian clock. But again, as I said, we do not really know how the process is triggered. You could, in theory, use drugs to basically prevent them from maintaining their body temperature, and this is what happens during anesthesia. So when you're anesthetized, usually you need a heating blanket so to have your body temperature maintained. Otherwise, you may cool down. This is why it is so important to monitor temperature when you are in the operating room under sedation or anesthesia. But this would be a less physiological approach. So ideally, we need to find the way how this process starts spontaneously.
You kind of mentioned it there in terms of the hypothermia, but what are the kind of risks that might be associated with inducing hibernation, short-term and also long-term?
Yeah, there are potentially many risks, and this is why we need to do more research, especially when we talk about brain function. Indeed, this is almost like an ethical question. So before we can induce a state of hibernation in a human being, we need to make sure we know, first of all, how to maintain the subject in that state in a kind of within normal physiological range of their functions. Also, how to bring the human being out of that state so it doesn't stay there forever in state of hibernation. And the main challenge is to make sure that when the human subject wakes up from hibernation, it is still the same person. And so he still has or she the memories from before, and to make sure that hibernation does not change anything fundamentally. And this could be anything. For example, we know that synaptic connections in the brain, they are pruned during hypothermia or during hibernation. Somehow these connections seem to be restored when the animals return to normal temperature. Again, this is a mysterious process. We do not really know how those connections know the way to reestablish. So we are actually doing a study together with a group in Italy. We are collaborating, and we want to look in more detail at this synaptic ultrastructure to understand better the dynamics. And this has much wider implications, of course, about synaptic plasticity, about memory mechanisms in general, because in this respect, torpor and hibernation represent a very, very interesting natural model experiment of nature that can be used to understand brain plasticity.
Amazing, thank you. Alison?
You mentioned sort of like the risks of hibernation, is there the possibility that someone could dream and be at all conscious throughout their hibernation period and sort of end up in a locked-in kind of syndrome?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So we, and this is something that we definitely need to consider as a possibility, especially that the idea is to induce a hibernation-like state, which is not cryosleep, so you would not be frozen, but your body temperature may be reduced just slightly. So all we need to know to ensure is that metabolic rates are reduced. So you consume less oxygen and you need less energy substrates to maintain bodily functions. This is definitely possible, and we know that even some tropical primates can hibernate. Obviously, it is quite warm there, so they do not cool down to like sub-zero temperatures as some other animals do, and yet their metabolic rates may decrease by 70%, which is very significant. But then, if you're in this state when you are warm and your brain function may be preserved, the possibility remains that you are actually conscious, or you can be conscious to some extent. So this has many different implications. For example, if you are hibernating and you are return to consciousness state, so you must be able to somehow report if you feel distress. So whatever systems where or someone is building like hibernaculum, this facility where humans may be hibernating, is very important. They're equipped with the systems to report your state, and we need to of course make sure that you are able to do that, and you are not, maybe you're in pain, maybe you're suffering actually when you are in hibernation and you're conscious. So whether you are dreaming, this is of course a question that is completely open right now. So even when we talk about our normal dreaming during normal sleep, it is also about very subjective experience, and we do not have ways to measure dreaming objectively, right? So we rely on subjective reports. So there is a study published recently where so-called serial awakening paradigm was studied by Francesco Sicleri and collaborators. So they wake up a subject every 20 minutes, and they ask about their experience immediately prior to awakening, and the subjects usually report some sort of experience, some sort of conscious experience almost every time. So you may be dreaming throughout your sleep period, and this is almost like a default state of our brain. So I actually do not exclude the possibility that some dreaming, some conscious experience may be happening while you're hibernating.
Rafi?
So the possibility of having astronauts sort of in a state of hibernation on the journey, for example, to Mars, is exciting. But what about for most people who would probably not get that opportunity, perhaps in our lifetimes? What does this study have, and what implications does it have for sort of the general population or the big questions in medical science outside of space travel, for example?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay. Well, we already talked a bit about anesthesia, for example, right? So we if you talk about various emergency procedures when you're put, for example, in a state of coma, like medical induced coma, sometimes for weeks and months. So what's the point of that? So you there are conditions when you need some neuroprotection to be in place. Reducing metabolism, and specifically brain metabolism, may be absolutely key and vital in this process. Because, as you know, if the brain does not receive enough oxygen or nutrients, you are unconscious within a few seconds, and then brain is dead within a few minutes, irreversibly. That's the huge, major issue. so to prevent that, we put patients in this artificial state of coma. And this may be dangerous. This is completely unphysiological. And if we find a way how to produce a state similar to hibernation, where we basically suspend metabolism, but in a more naturalistic way, this may be much better. It may have much better prospects for recovery, for example, recovery of functions. Another example, again, talking about neuroprotection, I can think of is if you talk about consequences of stroke. And this is, again, there is a lot of interesting research going on right now about potentially beneficial influence of sleep on recovery from stroke. But here again, the possibility of inducing a state when metabolic rates are reduced, so there is potentially less damage due to ischemia to the neurons, to the brain tissue. This again could have a very interesting potential.
I have another question. This was actually kind of Rafi's kind of idea when we were talking before, but what could be the link between hibernation and aging, and kind of maybe preventing aging, or I don't know, presumably preventing aging? Is there a possibility for that?
Yes, there is not much research, unfortunately, in this area. So there is definitely a relationship between the possibility of an animal going into hibernation and aging, and usually those animals who hibernate, they live longer. There is even some suggestion that since your all bodily functions are suspended when you're hibernating, there is also cells are not dividing, there is no mitosis, so and telomeres don't get shortened, and so there may be some possibility of actually extending lifespan during hibernation, but definitely more research is needed here. So you can even argue that when you're hibernating, if you talk about animals, so they are more protected, they're safe, they're hiding somewhere, and therefore predators cannot find them, and they survive longer. So it could be reason of that kind. But yes, definitely, this reduction in metabolism can make you last longer.
Amazing. And then what do you think is in the near future for this kind of research into hibernation and sleep? What do you think is coming next?
I like the way you asked this question with hibernation and sleep. So the field of sleep research as a field, I think, started about 100 years ago. So they started from this outbreak of encephalitis lethargica, which led to the ideas that there is a center of sleep in the brain, because patients who had lesions in the certain area of the hypothalamus, they would either sleep a lot or sleep very little. And Konstantin von Economo suggested that there is a center of sleep in the brain. So this was 100 years ago. Now we still don't, most of us have sleep problems at the end, or many of us, and we don't really know what to do about that. So we know a lot about sleep right now, but we are still far away from inducing sleep safely, reliably. There are still many big questions. With hibernation, there was a lot of research about metabolism and endocrinology side of things. Basically looking what happens in the body. With hibernation, we know much less what happens in the brain and the role of the brain in this in the first place. So I think we can learn a lot from the field of sleep and how field of sleep developed, especially over the last couple of decades, where we have understood a lot about brain mechanisms of that. So hibernation field is in a much better shape. So we have the tools, we have ideas. We of course can manipulate sleep experimentally. As I said, we still are not quite there yet, but we have tools and ideas which can be applied to hibernation. So I think it is promising. So as usual, we need probably funding. So this is really important. So every time when we have a meeting with the European Space Agency, we discuss bright ideas, and then at the end we say, okay, now we need the money. It all boils down to that. So I hope we'll convince the European Space Agency at some point, and that we are dealing with something of huge importance potentially, and I think we can make progress.
Yeah.
I think it is possible.
Wonderful. Alison and Rafi, do either of you have any more questions?
I was just interested in how far away you think we are from putting a human into a state of hibernation. Will we see that in our lifetimes, possibly?
I'm hopeful. I'm optimistic. At least during your lifetime, for sure. I think. Well, if probably our hope that Elon Musk will get interested in this, and so this can result in some progress. But seriously, I think we need to develop some new approaches. We need to start thinking a bit outside of the box. We need to think about new and unconventional models for that. And this was one of the reasons why I brought in hamsters here to Oxford. So we never had hamsters in Oxford. Now we have a colony because we can learn something from this species. You know, the species know how to enter state of torpor. They know and they do it. So we should look at our other animals, and I think. We can make progress then.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much, Vlad. I think that was really interesting. I'm definitely enthused to learn more about sleep and hibernation now.